Okay, welcome back to another podcast. We're churning these out now because boredom breeds creativity. So we're getting nice and thoughtful.
Sounds like you're about to start amping up a rugby team at boys' high school. Okay.
So we're just chatting now, and we've been thinking about it just because obviously the military is deployed now in South Africa, or the SANDF, the South African Defence Force, is out and about, and we were thinking they got us thinking about militaries and things like that, and we kind of like brought up a conversation. We thought we'd just record because we're in that kind of mindset. What is the role of a military in the modern world, or what is the value of a military, and how it should operate now that we're quite past wars being fought on a platoon scale,
Like hand to hand.
hand to hand. Yeah, I mean the reality now is if we have a massive world power, it's going to be a bombing fest,
Drones as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Unmanned
Exactly.
aircraft and whatever. Yeah, I think it's a question we should all be asking ourselves. I think what got me started was that, like, thinking it feels uncomfortable to me when armed forces are deployed in a civil situation. Obviously, I actually, in the beginning, I was very supportive of that decision. It just, when it becomes a reality, there's a certain uncomfortable feeling that comes up, and I was trying to investigate why I'm feeling uncomfortable about it. And I said to you, it was like, the concern is that it's like the military doesn't seem trained in civil situations, and you're like, well, why aren't they?
Yeah.
Or like, what is it? Why do you think that they're not? Now obviously neither of us have served in the military or the police, but from what I know about the training, it's quite different. I think if it's all going well and all going to plan, and the training's being conducted in the way it's supposed to, by the book, then police get far more training in civil situations. And they also, I feel, when it comes down to guns, they train generally not to shoot to kill,
Yeah.
The gun is to
mainly,
enforce power.
Obviously, one of the things that came up is that the requirement of the job is very different. I mean, yes, both of them are armed, but the reality is the soldier's armed to kill people.
Yeah.
And as policemen's armed to protect people.
Well, that's the thing that's scary, isn't it?
And so that's the mentality. And these people who have been armed to kill are now walking around, educating people on COVID-19. And obviously trying to keep the peace. And that's another thing, is that a peacekeeping force isn't necessarily always a military operation. Obviously, the UN was a military, but it was also very much kind of what we think of a peacekeeping force.
What do you mean, the UN Peace Corps?
Yeah, exactly. It was like, it was like a combination of everything. But what I wanted to say about this is that like, how can we think about strong militaries in an age where we aren't going to necessarily, it's like a very broad term, but
need them.
Yeah, need
like,
them. Inverted commas. Like, we're not going to go over the top, and we're not going to, I think it should become more specialized. In my opinion, I think you'll always need some form of physical force organization, obviously, because there's going to be people who disagree, and and there could be violence and stuff like that. But having a large standing army seems impractical. But then having an organization of people who can then firstly obviously have the discipline, the skills required to be, because the military is actually a very complex and well-oiled machine, and to have something like that I think is extremely useful even in civil situations, like flood relief, or famine, or the building of or the disaster, things like that where the military, in my opinion, that should be a huge calling for that.
So I think I want to address those questions with another question, and that's like, and I think I mentioned in a situation earlier, but I was like, why should those things be the military per se?
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
like they could just be there. So we have their own things, you know. So we
Yeah.
have disaster management, then we have like law enforcement, then we have traffic enforcement. It's already quite
Exactly,
split
yeah.
up, you know.
Yeah.
Like, and I think I would agree. I think we would want what do you call it, like force units
Yeah.
in society, whether any type of enforcement unit, you do want them to be specialized and well trained in
But-
specific scenarios.
See, now, so now this is what I'm thinking, is that like I almost the way I'm thinking about it is the value of why I keep saying the military is because you have a single person that's trained in discipline and in acquiring skills.
Yeah.
Like that's what I think a normal foot soldier in my head is that it's just a guy that knows how to do his job and is able to then learn how to do other jobs if required. And I think that's how I'm thinking of like a large group of people that are then able to be then under the supervision of of specialists, able to enact things quite well due to the discipline they offer. Of a thing of, okay, cool, you get 50 Marines together and you say build a bridge, and you give them like 2 combat engineers, they'll be able to build a bridge. You know, but if you give 50 civilians together and you say build a bridge, it's going to take a while.
Right.
And you know, it's the discipline that I'm discussing. I'm thinking about.
I see the value you're talking about in
Yeah.
non-civil
Yeah.
labor.
Yeah.
And I do agree. I think there's a big the connection in my head keeps rushing back to like Maoist times.
Yeah.
Obviously,
I'm thinking Roman here as well.
Jeez, yeah.
Like the Roman army built all the roads. You know, that kind of mentality.
So like if you, and something that's super important, the reason why I'm trying to connect it with like communist China, actual communist China, well, if it ever existed, is like the mass education of military personnel. So like to serve any government organ, you had to like prove yourself politically. Now it was super extreme in China, I think, and the level of extremity forced a lot of bad stuff. So like people, you know, there's a lot of infighting, and then like tattletale and being like,
Yes.
Luke doesn't want to serve the party. He said these things, and you're just lying. And I think a lot of that from
social, like,
from what I've read, that kind of disintegrated the reality of it, even all the way at the top. But I think the idea there is important, and it's something for us as civilians to consider as well. Is like, why are we not philosophically and politically trained from a younger age? You know, and to me it's a problem of neoliberalism and consumerism. We're so
individualistic.
That's not even the issue. That's almost a byproduct, in my opinion. But we're so occupied with day-to-day life and all the other stuff.
This is what I was going to say.
That we never educate ourselves. But I also don't think that burden falls on the individual in a society. I think it's important that education is provided, and even like mandatory to some extent. Definitely for non-civil units, you know. So like if you're going to serve in the military or the police or even disaster management, fire department, any government organ, you should have to go through some level of political education, so you understand firstly like what the country's about constitutionally, and basic grasp of like
and
civil rights and
things,
laws and processes, and understanding how the bureaucracy works as well.
So then it becomes very bureaucratic, and I think, you know, and then there's a fine line between that and obviously what happened in Mao's China, which was indoctrination, you know. And then the issue is that obviously I'm thinking about this force as a very force for good and positive. But whenever you create a structure where discipline is everything, and you have a hierarchical command structure, then it falls on the leadership to obviously not manipulate that situation. You know, and then how do you have a strong, efficient and well-oiled machine without letting like the people in charge of it, break it, because then it becomes a dictatorship. Because the whole value of this is that in my head I'm like, okay, cool, we need 50 schools. I'm going to tell people to build 50 schools, and in my head that's great.
Yeah.
But the reality is it's quite. It becomes it dissolves quite quickly. I
think what you need is a government organization, a government itself, a parliament, whatever, that is well represented and actively represented by citizens in the country.
Yeah.
I think the way our democracy works in South Africa, it's not the easiest to play a super active role, although we play probably a more active role than other democratic nations. But it's important to really have the participation, and more importantly, the negative participation. So, like, a lot of people in general will trust government to make good decisions. Like that's, it sounds like a weird thing to say, but it genuinely, the peace in a country, it relies on the trust of its citizens for the government to make like at least decent decisions, even if they don't agree with them all the time.
Yeah.
And the burden of responsibility on the voter or the citizen in society is to strongly criticize when they feel like that's not happening, right? So you need that participation so that your government organization is able to control your armed forces and your
you need like that
other
buy-in.
force agencies.
You obviously need the buy-in, and something we chatted about was like, I don't know if you watched Starship Troopers or read the book.
I haven't.
Anyway, Starship Troopers was basically like written by a guy who was kind of like writing it as like a satire of the Vietnam War in a way, where he was just saying that the idea of having a required military thing, it explored a lot of things. Basically, one of the concepts was civil service, and you had to earn your right to be a citizen. Like you were a civilian until you became a citizen, which then afforded you rights. And in order to do that, you had to do military service.
Okay.
And I think there's a lot of value in that concept when you think about civil service, not military service, of where you have a large group of people that, in some time in their life, they added value to the organization. So there's kind of a required buy-in.
Yeah.
If and I think that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like, okay, cool. If you want to benefit from the work that we're all paying tax, we're all doing this. You should give some work back. And I think there's a lot of value in exploring the idea of like civil service, and not mandatory civil service. I mean civil service in the sense of how the US runs its military, where you go to the military in order to upskill yourself so that you can then explore other jobs because you couldn't quite get into university on your own. Whether it was funding or whether it was, and that's how they bribe their citizens into military service, and I've got a mate that wants to do that as well. Where you can then study afterwards. And I think that has a lot of value, for instance, if you think of it as in, okay, cool, for 1 year you get paid like a salary that you can survive on, and you do work, whether it be administrative or building a road or something like that, where you can add value to a governmental body, and then at the end of that you can obviously then have an opportunity to explore other things. And I think in my head that should be the transition of civil service, because it doesn't make any sense to learn to shoot a gun when, like, that's not how we're going to fight wars. It's just
and I mean, we wouldn't want to be
we wouldn't want to be in a war anyway,
wars.
and it wouldn't make any sense. Like, who are you going to fight? And then the trade embargoes, and then just in the globalized economy, the only wars being fought currently are.
Well, I think that word is the key there. Globalized economy or globalization. I think that's something to consider in the conversation about civil services. Like, really, what it is or what it should be is time given in serving society in general, like a global society. Yeah. Yes, especially if you live in a country where more participation is necessary. I.e. a country where a lot of stuff still needs to get done. Like, we have things that aren't right and aren't running 100% smoothly, you need the participation in those activities to get them up to scratch. Then it should be focused locally. But it's a general thing. Like it shouldn't be like a nationalist.
And then that's the thing. Like
feeling.
Even if you look at like South Korea after the Korean War, and obviously, I mean, the US pumped a lot of money into that. But the thing is with the idea of the fact that people for the first 2 generations gave up. Like, they all kind of came together to work in the steel factories in order to get the economy going, you know? And there was the kind of mentality, and I read I read a book on it, where it was kind of how it was this generational feeling of they understood that in order to get what country they had together, they all had to sacrifice to put the work in to get things done, you know? And I think that's a very easy concept to understand until, like, you start asking adults, and I use adults very loosely, of this idea of, okay, cool, it's the same thing, like in preschool you understand you have to do work in order to get somewhere, and it seems like this thing of you turn 20 or 18 and now you're out of school, and now there's nothing holding you back, and the idea of asking those people to be like, hey, why don't you give up a year or whatever and come work in this thing so that we can all help the country together is such a crazy concept, but it's logical. Just like, well, then how else is it going to get done?
If we're all doing it, then it would.
You know, many hands make light work.
It would immediate. The results would see the results immediately. So.
And it's the same. It's the same.
I think it would sell itself once it started.
100%. And it's the same thing of how in like the 1950s, where after the thing is like it was kind of like this thing of, you know, the dad was like, oh, my son's unruly, you know, he should go to the military. And then you ship off to the military and he comes back as like a gentleman and he's respectful and he's disciplined now, you know, of this kind of concept. And that's an extreme example. I mean, there's a lot of value in doing that, in the sense of going to go work somewhere. And I mean, there's a lot of parents who, I mean, I've heard the conversation all the time where parents are like, oh, I wish my child would just understand responsibility. You know, that kind of conversation. And I think that inside of civil service would be beneficial of having like a workforce that was able to do that, you know?
Yeah.
Without it being fully communist. Like, it doesn't even have to be communist. It just
I think
sense.
Well, I think the important thing is, like for me, a part of, if you're going to have some sort of mandatory civil service, right, which I agree with, I think that is a perfect scenario to introduce like thought training. Like, people should be provided with political and philosophical content that they can learn about and understand, like the workings of thought and the workings of society and sociology, and just like grasp what's going on, or engage with the world, you know, get an opportunity to actually engage with the world before they get so distracted by their own lives, you know.
And I get what you're saying, like kind of like a university, like a crash course university, like these things could be kind of workforces. And I read a book called Utopia that was written back in like the 1800s, about a guy that basically made up a world, and what he describes is a utopian communist state in a way. But I mean, that's a great book. You guys should check it out if you. It's called Utopia. But the point is that there's a lot of value in firstly the work, but the danger of like the pitch now, and I can imagine there's a whole bunch of like older people that are like, yeah, but then you can just, you know, indoctrinate people and they can go off on their own, and so that's the issue of how do you create an open education system in a structured kind of environment. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah,
How do you not make it sound like indoctrination?
You know what? What's difficult for me is the neoliberal teachings are so strong right now in this day and age that there's so much for us to overcome, and that's the problem. You're absolutely right. That is the hurdle. Is everyone's going to disagree on what people need to get taught.
Yeah.
However, like, I'm inclined to say you, in a non-practical scenario, I would say, well, I'll set the not myself, but like we set the reading list very clearly and strategically.
Yeah.
However, I know that there's always going to be disagreements, but I'm inclined to say we'll provide a whole spectrum of information and encourage discussion and stuff. And I truly believe that if you rationally discuss ethics and politics and ideology in general in a rational and productive way, you'll come to a lot of similar places. People will come to a lot of similar places.
So adding to that, I think hitting the nail on the head. I think it becomes less of a thing of giving them a set amount of knowledge. I think the fact that we have the internet means knowledge is arbitrary. I think what would be more important is in this scenario where we have a group of people doing something, would be creating the same kind of situation that we had the chat the other day about how I don't feel smart because I didn't go through the same steps other people went through in university. Where it's more important isn't the information as much as the culture.
Yeah, how you think.
Of rational debate and things like that. And then inside of that, it will be very quickly, like, for instance, if you're like me, as soon as you become slightly aware of something, you think you know the answer. And then you just slowly get beat down by people who know more to the point where you're like, okay, cool, I know nothing, I'm going to educate myself. And then you come back into the fold, because you're able then to explore it for yourself. And that's a part of being young. But in general, I think that kind of framework of understanding where it's not necessarily knowledge, but it's the rational debate and the conversation, and that part of the education is probably fundamentally more important than...
You mean teach a method of thinking, or how to think as opposed to what to think?
Yes, exactly what we're doing here, of just of making thought practical and stuff like that. I mean, I didn't go to university, so I'm speaking from what you've told me. But in general, there's like a requirement to enter into conversation to know about what you're talking about,
Yeah.
And if we can make that an important thing, I think the world changes, firstly. But a practical way of doing that would be creating the culture where you have that discussion,
Yeah.
You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I do.
And I think that solves the problem of the knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it will solve it, but it's a good start. That's a satisfactory start for me to be like, okay, well, people are going to be provided with skills to think.
Yeah.
And I think there is certain stuff that needs to be provided later on, but
it will all be provided. You just have it all. That's what I'm kind of going for. Where you have everything's available to you. But there's just a structure of conversation and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's going back to the military thing. I think to answer the initial question, like what role does military play?
Yeah.
I would say at this point, or even just from a local perspective here, the military can be used as a very useful tool, like you said, to improve society, etc., which I'm not sure it does at the moment.
No. There's a lot of pride that comes from having a military.
It's very inaccurate. And I know, but that's the exact type of thing we need to move away from, because pride is nationalistic. So we don't want a nationalist army. People shouldn't be in the army because they want to defend South Africa. That's the wrong idea.
Yeah.
You should be... the kind of education I'm talking about is that you should be serving in the military if that's what you want to do.
You don't want
to serve society.
But even then, you don't want evangelist military members.
What do you mean?
Like, so let's say we have this system and people are educated now, and then they're like, okay, cool, South Africa's the greatest. We have good thought system.
No one that's at the opposite of what should be.
No, that's what I'm saying. So we have a good constitutional system, our laws are the best, everything we do is the most practical, therefore you should listen to what we're saying.
Okay.
Because it can very quickly go...
Are you saying you don't want that?
I'm saying I don't want that,
okay.
But I'm saying is that's the danger of having it like, okay, cool, everyone's educated, and then people run off with it and like, oh yeah, like, because of that we're the best. You know what I'm trying to say?
Oh, sure. I think that's something that we have to constantly be aware of.
Yeah.
But again, it comes down to method of thinking and remembering what there has to. So you can provide people with tools, but there has to be core ideology. That's the thing that I can't escape in this conversation. There has to be core ideology. Otherwise, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Like the idea of free thought, and I'm putting inverted commas around that, is that you can like think whatever you want, but like you actually can't. It's the same as like having a whole lot of rights. You can't just have rights without responsibility.
Yeah.
In the same way, you can't just think what you want without being responsible for the thoughts that you have. So you have to ground the thinking you do in ideology that makes sense. You can't ground it or not have it grounded or whatever. You know, it's like having the right of free speech. People love to talk about it.
Yeah.
You can't just say whatever you want to say. Your words have an impact on the world. You have to use that right that you have with responsibility. You know,
Yeah.
and that's why, you know, like now we've got more hectic in South Africa about enforcing the responsibilities of those rights. You know, so like
Yeah.
you can't use free speech to be racist or that type of thing. So I think there still has to be some sort of core ideology underlying, and that's like that comes from asking human questions like what are ethics, like what does it mean to be human? Am I a self-interested animal, or am I drawn to something more than just being a self-interested animal? These are the first questions you have to ask yourself, and then after that you can start coming with the more complex societal based questions. That only comes afterwards, but there has to be a core ideology to start with.
So basically, don't think the military should be as imperialistic as it is. You know.
I don't think our military is imperialist
No,
at all.
I don't think it is. But I think militaries in general.
Yes.
Like the idea of
military
invading
is
a country is arbitrary.
exactly.
Like-
I think
like,
that
well,
if
why-
that's sitting behind your military,
Yeah,
then
exactly,
yes, it
exactly.
has an imperialist.
You know, and I mean we've got a particularly
Stance.
good concept. We have a good ideology governing our military, where it's called the South African Defence Force. You know, I'm pretty like I think in general our military is like it's not bad. You know, I think we have a good
I
idea.
just don't think they have
going
much
for
to
it.
do.
I just don't think they have much to do, and that's kind of the point. Is that it's a huge waste of resource, and it could be implemented into civil situations with the right
Yeah,
training.
I think we can use that. I think that's the point.
Yeah,
of where we're
the
trying to
the
get
whole
is that-
point is that the military should be used in civil situations with the right training,
Yeah, for not as a force unit.
not as a
You
force
could
unit,
you can use it as a practical unit
a practical unit.
to provide like civil relief and etc. etc. And then on top of that, those nuclearized civil service units can be fleshed out, and more people can feed into those things. You know.
No.
Yeah.
Okay. If any of you guys are part of the SANDF, is that South African National Defence Force? Yeah, hit us up. Let us know
Yeah.
what it's like. Let us know what your training's like. Otherwise,
Or
yeah.
if you've done any sort of police training, also interested in that and how
I think-
extensive it is and
yeah.
what the specific, especially when it comes to dealing with like civil disobedience cases and just like maintaining peace. I'm very interested in what exact specific training happens.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. We're just a bit of a brain fart, but yeah, I think a lot of good points in there. Yeah, keep well, stay safe, and yeah, don't aggravate people with rifles. It's just a bad idea.
That's a no, yeah.
Cheers. Perfect.